Betsy, I'm so delighted to see you again and to kind of reconnect. There's been so many interesting things that have happened since, you were in both of those books, Wisdom of the
Yeah,
Silver Sisters
I
and Golden
was.
Wisdom.
I was, yes.
And now for those that are listening, of course, you have the book in hand, or otherwise you probably wouldn't be seeing this video. This is also kind of put together by Sharon Jordan and Hathcock, who we totally love. And this book is very, very different. It is The Imaginist, Fairytales, Fables and Folklore. And Betsy, you had an opportunity to write a chapter for this book as well. I want to hear about it. Tell us a little bit about, because I haven't
Sharon
received
expanded.
it.
I'm sorry. Sharon expanded it a bit to include people who made a difference and who had moved on.
Mhm.
And I had written in the previous book a chapter about my favorite ex-con, Tom Brown. I never quite did him justice in our interview before. So I want people to know, yeah, he's an ex-con, and I told his story in that book. Was a genuinely kind man who, as he called it, lived in gratitude. He got out of prison with $50 to his name and set about just being a good person. He'd always been a good person. I've learned a lot about him over the years, more frankly, since he's died, because I have his papers and things like that, and just how profound a thinker he was, and that all of that depth was there even before he went to prison. And without giving the whole story away, he was in prison for 14 years for financial fraud, and was one of those people who thought they could game the system by waiting for the real estate market to turn, because he knew it would, and we all know it will. But most of us don't go around assuming that it's going to happen soon, quickly enough.
Sooner than later.
Right. And he brought in more investors, and everything went to hell because the market didn't come back fast enough. And he wound up going to prison for 14 years and losing everything. He was a very successful businessman. And when he went into prison, he was humiliated and just shamed, and he had let his friends down. Many of his investors were friends, and they forgave him, but he also, there were banks and financial companies and everyone had a piece, and they wanted it. And so everything was sold, and 14 years in prison. And so in his humiliation and shame and sadness, he was trying to figure, what was he going to do with his life? He was, nearly 70 years old at the time. And he said, I have nothing left but to be a loving presence. And my chapter that I wrote for the last book tells that story, how he became a loving presence in ways that he lived it, the ways that he lived it inside prison and out. And he died recently. He was 91, 91 in May, and we had a nice party for him with some close friends. But over the last 2 years, he'd had many, many, many different health crises.
Right.
He wasn't terminally ill with any disease, but he had fallen and broken his shoulder. He'd fallen and sprained this. His legs were weak, and he was trying to exercise and be better. And then he'd get an infection, and he was in the hospital, in a recovery place, back out to his home, and one doctor appointment after another. And this last time when he wound up in the hospital and then back into a recovery home, he said, I've just lost my joy. I never thought I would lose my joy. And for people many people have never met him, but know him on Facebook, because he was a
presence.
And he was a punster, and he wrote very thoughtful essays that he posted too. And he was a joyful person. He brought joy to people who knew him. So for his joy to go, he said he was ready to go. And I said, Tom, you just don't always get to go when you want to.
Right. Right.
But he did wind up moving into an assisted living home and was still thinking about how he just wished he could stop breathing and die, because, and he wasn't grumpy about it or anything. He just was very realistic, and it was time. He'd do it all. And, it's just, you're either 90, made it to your 90s, and it was time to go. And then the last time I saw him, I went in and he said, I woke up today and I realized that, I'd always wanted to be someone who was in control. And I suppose that even being a loving presence was a form of control for himself. This is what he would do. And he made it his point to live out the rest of his life being a loving presence. And he said, I woke up this morning and realized that I've always wanted control, and I've released control, and I feel so much better. I'm not even thinking about checking out anymore, because he said, I wish I could just check out. And so we had a very nice chat, and I had gotten a whoopee cushion for him for his birthday, but it had come late. So that was back in May, and we never had the opportunity to, play with it. So I blew it up and we put it in his guest chair. And one of his friends came. They had a weekly Zoom meeting among some male friends, and he had his friend sit in it so that was on a Saturday, and he could hardly wait to tell me about it. It was so funny. He said, but the only thing is the fellows were on the Zoom call, so we've got to figure out something else for them. Right. So he was ready for more pranks. And and then he died on Tuesday, just like that. I think maybe that releasing control and wanting to stop his heart from beating and all of those things, once he let go of that control, maybe that allowed him to move on. And so really, that is my chapter. I did rework my original chapter about the things that happened in prison that were,
I remember
so funny and moving, and so the other people who maybe didn't read it then can read it now with a little bit more to it.
That's
beautiful. And Sharon invited me to add other things to it too, which I did, but they're easily removed if you need to do that.
No, Sharon's pretty intuitive that way. So grateful from having known him is the name of your chapter. And what a beautiful contribution. I remember him being in the Golden Wisdom book this past year.
Yes.
And I even got the chance to interview them. That's the first time I had met him. What a blessing and privilege that was, because he had such a sparkle plenty.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He really did. And he was the kind of person who, this was his part of being a loving presence. He expressed, and he called it, he said he lived his life in gratitude. Here he had nothing, and he lived his life in gratitude. And in part, what I realized what he did was he always told people, anyone who helped him, who did anything, I appreciate you so much. And it was heartfelt. He told the person that brought his bedpan, how much he appreciated her and how much he appreciated the person that brought the food. And they would say, nobody's ever told me that before, and I thought so much about all of that while writing this chapter, and about the lesson that I really came away from with Tom is that kindness that we all felt and appreciated, he expressed it was because he was grateful. He was grateful for the people around him. He was grateful for being alive. He was grateful for everything that came his way.
Well, wasn't that the better alternative than being ugly and bitter about what happened and having to spend all those years in prison?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
you can
Well,
be choose.
he never denied what happened. He just said, you know, it was he was so foolish, you know, he really thought that he'd be able to make everything back and more. And it fell apart, and that was his fault. He said he knew it wasn't the right thing to be doing, right? So I think that's part of the reason, and that was part of the loving presence too, recognizing that and that people had been hurt, and there was not a thing he could do about it because everything was gone anyway.
Right, right. And to get out of prison at an older age like that and have nothing really,
Yeah,
what are you going to do?
80 years old.
Wow.
Lived in a Section 8 apartment, 450 square feet. I think it was 425 maybe square feet. Yeah, yeah.
But he kept on smiling and making other people happy.
He
And
did.
while he was in prison, if I remember the story, he taught many young men how to read and write and how to get their GED.
That's right.
I mean,
Right.
he really served in very strong and healthy ways to make a
Right.
difference, and very loved by a number of people, just
Oh,
simply
yeah.
because he didn't let it, as many would. Many would just turn ugly and bitter, and he didn't let that happen.
He didn't. He gave back from the day he went in. He became a teacher, and they did love him. And one of the people on our group text of intimate friends is one of his former students from prison who has turned his life around.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it is awesome.
Well, thank you so much for the contribution to this book and for the sharing the legacy of his story, of Tom Brown's story, and for caring enough to do that on his behalf.
Well, it's the least I can do. He has been such a blessing for our family and everyone who knows him. So such a pleasure.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for this beautiful time together, and I'm looking forward to celebrating as we get this book out to the world, and
Me too.
maybe we'll get to see each other in person again.
I would like that.
That would be awesome.
We need to do that more often.
Yes, for sure.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'll stop this recording. So anybody that has this is seeing this video has probably got the book in hand. Be sure and really take the time to listen to not only the video but to read the words. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.